Sometimes, the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest acts of kindness. Caleb Brooks never imagined that accepting a landscaping job at a forgotten estate would change everything. A widowed father struggling to make ends meet. He arrives at Serena Vale's mansion expecting to clear weeds and collect his modest paycheck. Instead, he discovers acres of dying gardens that once bloomed with love and memory. The billionaire tech mogul who owns the property has retreated from the world, her heart as barren as the neglected grounds her late parents once cherished. But Caleb sees beyond the thorns and decay. With gentle hands and patient care, he begins, restoring not just the garden, but awakening something profound in both their lives. His young daughter Mia becomes the bridge between two broken souls, learning to trust again. Yet as their unlikely friendship deepens into something more, the outside world threatens to destroy the fragile paradise they've begun to build together. When Serena's past collides with Caleb's desperate fight to keep his daughter, will their newfound love survive the storm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's insistent buzz cut through the early morning stillness of the cramped two-bedroom apartment, though Caleb Brooks had already been awake for 20 minutes, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked remarkably like his late wife's profile. 5:30 came earlier each day, it seemed, especially when sleep remained as elusive as the landscaping contracts that had once sustained his small business. He rolled from the narrow bed, his joints protesting the cheap mattress that Sarah would have replaced years ago. She'd always been practical about such things, understanding that a good night's rest was an investment, not an expense. But Sarah had been gone for 18 months now, and practicality had given way to survival, one modest paycheck at a time. The floorboards creaked beneath his bare feet as he padded to the kitchenette, muscle memory guiding him around the boxes that still hadn't found permanent homes. Moving to this place had been necessity, not choice. The house he'd shared with Sarah, the one with the wraparound porch and the quarter-acre garden she'd tended with religious devotion, had slipped away along with everything else when the medical bills mounted and his grief made it impossible to focus on running Brooks Landscaping. Coffee first, always coffee first. The ritual grounded him. The familiar motions of measuring grounds and water, a small anchor in days that often felt unmoored. As the machine gurgled to life, he pulled Sarah's garden journal from the drawer where he kept it wrapped in one of her silk scarves. The leather binding had softened with age and handling, its pages filled with her careful handwriting, pressed flowers, and sketches of plantings that had transformed their modest backyard into something magical. Gardens aren't just about the plants, she'd written on the first page. They're about patience, hope, and the faith that tomorrow will bring something beautiful. He traced the words with his fingertip. The ink slightly faded, but the sentiment as clear as the day she'd written it. Sarah had possessed an almost mystical connection to growing things, an intuitive understanding of what each plant needed to thrive. She could nurse the most stubborn rose back to health and coax blooms from soil that seemed barren to everyone else. The coffee finished brewing just as 8-year-old Mia emerged from her bedroom, her dark hair, so much like her mother's, forming a rebellious crown around her sleep-flushed face. She wore mismatched pajamas and carried her favorite stuffed elephant, a threadbare creature named Peanut that had seen better days. "Morning, sunshine," Caleb said, ruffling her hair as she climbed onto the kitchen stool. "Sleep okay?" Mia shrugged, the gesture so reminiscent of Sarah that it caught him off guard. "I dreamed about Mom's garden again, the one with the blue flowers that smelled like vanilla." "Sweet alyssum," he said softly. "She planted them along the front border every spring. I miss them." Mia's voice carried the matter-of-fact sadness of a child who had learned too young that some losses couldn't be fixed with Band-Aids and ice cream. Caleb poured orange juice into her favorite cup, the one with butterflies that Sarah had picked up at a garage sale, and set it beside a bowl. of cereal. I know, sweetheart, I miss them too. As Mia ate, he reviewed the day's schedule such as it was. Mrs. Henderson needed her gutters cleaned, a job that would pay enough to cover groceries for the week. After that, he had a consultation with a new client who'd found his number on one of the few business cards still circulating around town. The woman had been vague on the phone, mentioning only that she had extensive grounds that needed attention and was willing to pay well for discretion and quality work. The consultation was scheduled for 2 o'clock at an address in Millbrook Heights, the exclusive enclave where old money met new tech fortunes behind iron gates and carefully manicured hedges. It had been months since he'd worked in that neighborhood, back when Brooks Landscaping had contracts with 3 of the area's most prestigious properties, before grief and financial strain had forced him to let his crew go and sell his equipment. To pay Sarah's medical bills. "Daddy, are you sad again?" Mia's voice pulled him from his reverie. "Just thinking, little bug." He managed a smile, the kind that parents perfect when they need to be strong for small eyes that see too much. "Tell you what, how about we stop for ice cream after I pick you up from school today? Mrs. Patterson said you've been helping with the classroom garden." Mia brightened considerably. "We planted sunflowers last week. Mrs. Patterson says they'll grow taller than me if we take good care of them." "Your mom would have loved that," Caleb said, and meant it. Sarah had always believed that children should grow up with dirt under their fingernails and wonder in their hearts. After dropping Mia at school, Lincoln Elementary, where the teachers knew their situation and watched out for her with extra kindness, Caleb spent the morning at Mrs. Henderson's house cleaning gutters that hadn't been touched in years. The work was mindless and physical, requiring just enough attention to keep darker thoughts at bay. Mrs. Henderson, a widow herself, paid him in cash and pressed a bag of homemade cookies into his hands for Mia. By noon, he was driving through the winding roads of Millbrook Heights, his pickup truck looking shabby among the luxury vehicles that belonged in this rarefied air. The houses here weren't just homes. They were statements, each one set back from the road behind gates and gardens that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The address led him to a wrought iron gate flanked by stone pillars, each topped with an ornate lantern. Beyond the gate, a cobblestone driveway curved through what had once been formal gardens, but now resembled something from a fairy tale gone wrong. Overgrown hedges pressed against the drive, and wild vines had claimed much of the visible landscape, creating an almost impenetrable wall of green chaos. Through the tangle, he caught glimpses of what lay beneath, the bones of something extraordinary. Even from the road, he could see that this hadn't been mere landscaping, but true garden artistry, the kind of thoughtful design that honored both the natural landscape and the vision of someone who understood beauty in its deepest sense. The house. Beyond the gardens was a Georgian masterpiece, its red brick facade mellowed with age and partially obscured by climbing roses that had grown wild without pruning. Dormant windows stared out like closed eyes, their shutters drawn against the world. The whole property had an air of abandonment, as if time had simply stopped and left everything to the mercy of nature's reclaiming hand. Caleb pressed the intercom button beside the gate, noticing how even the brass was tarnished with neglect. "Mr. Brooks?" The voice was cultured, carefully modulated, with the kind of pronunciation that came from expensive schools and careful breeding. "Yes, Mom. Here for the consultation about your grounds." A long pause followed, filled only with the sound of wind moving through the overgrown hedges. Then the gate clicked and began to swing open with mechanical precision, revealing the full scope of what awaited him. As he drove slowly up the cobblestone drive, Caleb felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's. Illness had consumed their lives, the gardener's equivalent of a doctor seeing a patient who could be saved. This wasn't mere neglect. This was a masterpiece in hibernation, waiting for someone with the skill and patience to wake it from its slumber. The driveway ended in a circular court before the main house, where a fountain stood silent and dry, its classical figures stained with moss and bird droppings. To his left, what had once been a formal parterre garden was now a battlefield where cultivated plants warred with invasive species for dominance. To his right, he could make out the skeletal remains of a rose garden, the carefully planned beds, still visible beneath years of weeds and volunteer growth, but it was the view beyond these formal gardens that took his breath away. The property sloped gently toward what appeared to be a natural pond, its edges lined with mature oaks and maples. That had been spared the surrounding chaos. Even from this distance, he could see the potential, the way the landscape wanted to flow, the natural sightlines that could be restored, the framework of mature plantings that could anchor a restoration worthy of this place's obvious heritage. Movement at one of the upstairs windows caught his eye, a pale face behind glass, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it, but the impression lingered. Someone watching, evaluating, perhaps as curious about him as he was becoming. About this forgotten paradise. Caleb parked his truck beside the fountain and stepped out, his trained eye already cataloguing what he saw. The challenges were immense, certainly, but beneath the chaos lay the foundation of something remarkable. Someone had loved this place once, had poured time and care and considerable resources into creating a landscape that honored both art and nature. As he walked closer to the main house, he noticed details that spoke to the garden's former glory. Hand-carved limestone borders along the pathways, antique garden ornaments half hidden by overgrowth, and specimens of trees and shrubs that represented decades of careful cultivation. This wasn't the work of a contractor hired to fill space with generic plantings. This was the result of someone who had understood gardens as living art, who had planned not just for immediate beauty, but for the way the landscape would mature and evolve over time. The front door was solid mahogany, its brass fittings green, with verdigris but still dignified in their decay. Before he could knock, it opened to reveal a woman, perhaps 10 years younger than his own, 42 years, though her bearing suggested someone who had carried responsibilities far beyond her. Age? Serena Vale was smaller than he'd expected from her voice, but there was nothing diminished about her presence. Dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing a face that was striking rather than conventionally beautiful. Strong cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes, and the kind of pale complexion that came from spending too much time indoors. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a cream-colored sweater, but even Caleb's untrained eye could recognize quality in the cut and fabric. "Mr. Brooks," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, though he noticed the slight tremor that suggested this interaction was costing her something. "Thank you for coming. I realize the scope of the work might be somewhat daunting." He found himself smiling for the first time in weeks, a genuine expression that felt rusty with disuse. "Ma'am, daunting is when you've got a blank slate and no vision. What you've got here is a masterpiece that just needs some attention. The bones are all there, beautiful bones." Something shifted in her expression, a tiny crack in what he was beginning to recognize as carefully maintained composure. "You see, that, even like this, especially like this," he said, "takes a trained eye to see past the obvious neglect to what somebody built here. Whoever designed these gardens knew what they were doing. This kind of work, it's not just landscaping, it's legacy." The word seemed to hit her unexpectedly, and for a moment her careful mask slipped entirely, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath, but she recovered quickly, that professional composure sliding back into place like armor. "Perhaps," she said, "you'd like to see the extent of the property before we discuss terms?" The walk through Serena Vale's property was like touring the ruins of a lost civilization, one where beauty had once reigned supreme before being surrendered to time and neglect. What Caleb had glimpsed from the driveway was merely the prologue. to a story of abandonment that grew more heartbreaking with each step. They followed a flagstone path that meandered through what had clearly been designed as a series of garden rooms, each with its own character and purpose. The first was a formal herb garden, its geometric beds still visible beneath a tangle of weeds and volunteer plants that had seeded themselves wherever they pleased. Caleb could identify the survivors: rosemary bushes grown woody and wild, lavender that had spread far beyond its original borders, and mint that had staged a complete takeover of what once must have been carefully delineated sections. "My mother's herb garden," Serena said quietly, following his gaze. She spent hours here every morning, deadheading and harvesting. The kitchen always smelled like whatever she'd brought in: basil in summer, sage in fall. Her voice carried a weight that spoke of deeper losses than mere garden neglect. Caleb had learned to recognize that particular tone in the 18 months since Sarah's death, the way people spoke about the beloved dead when the wounds were still tender. "How long has it been?" he asked gently, not needing to specify what. He meant 3 years. The words came out clipped, as if saying them quickly might lessen their impact. Car accident. Both of them, coming back from their anniversary dinner. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of wind moving through overgrown branches and the distant call of a mockingbird that had claimed territory somewhere in the chaos. Caleb found himself thinking of Sarah, of how gardens became monuments to those who created them, living memorials that could either honor or haunt. They continued deeper into the property, past a children's play area where an elaborate wooden swing set had been partially reclaimed by climbing vines. A sandbox sat filled with leaves and debris, its edges softened by moss. Everything spoke of a family life interrupted, of plans abandoned, and joy suspended. "You have children?" Caleb asked, though something in the profound stillness of the place suggested otherwise. "No." The word was sharp, final, closing off that avenue of conversation entirely. They emerged from a grove of mature dogwoods into what took Caleb's breath away. A rose garden that must have been spectacular in its prime. Even now, buried under years of neglect, the structure was magnificent. Terraced beds cascaded down a gentle slope toward the pond he'd glimpsed earlier, with brick pathways winding between plantings that had been designed to bloom in succession, from spring through fall. But the roses themselves were a tragedy. Unpruned for years, they had grown into massive, ungainly tangles, their branches reaching skyward in desperate search of light. Suckers had sprouted everywhere, creating thickets of thorny growth that bore little resemblance to the careful cultivars they had once been. Black spot and other diseases had claimed many entirely, leaving skeletal remains among the chaos. "Dear God," Caleb whispered, stopping dead in his tracks. "I know it's beyond saving," Serena said quickly, misreading his expression. "I should have called someone years ago, but I just couldn't bear to see it torn out." "Torn out?" Caleb turned to stare at her. "Ma'am, you don't tear out a garden like this. You resurrect it." He moved closer to one of the larger specimens, a climbing rose that had completely enveloped what appeared to be an arbor entrance to the lower terrace. Pushing carefully through the thorny mass, he found what he was looking for: the graft union, still healthy and strong, a new growth that showed the plant's essential vigor despite its bedraggled appearance. "Look here," he called to Serena, who had followed him at a cautious distance. "See this new growth? Clean and healthy. The root systems are still strong. They're just confused about what they're supposed to be doing. With proper pruning and care, most of these could bloom again within a season." Serena approached hesitantly, as if the garden might hurt her simply by being seen too closely. "You really think so?" "I know so." Caleb's voice carried the certainty of experience. "Roses are tougher than people give them credit for. They want to bloom. It's what they're made for. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them how." They spent the next hour touring the rest of the property, and with each area they explored, Caleb's amazement grew. There was a kitchen garden with raised beds built from mellow brick, a cutting garden designed to supply the house with fresh flowers, and a small orchard where apple and pear trees had grown wild but still bore fruit. At the property's far edge, the promised pond reflected the sky like a mirror, its edges lined with cattails and wild iris that had naturalized beautifully. But it was when they reached the garden shed that Caleb felt the true emotional impact of what had been lost. The building itself was substantial, more of a small barn than a typical garden shed, with hand-hewn beams and diamond-pane windows that spoke of the same quality and attention to detail that marked the rest of the property. Inside, everything had been left exactly as it was the last time someone had used it. Tools hung in careful order on pegboard walls, their handles worn smooth by years of use. Terracotta pots were stacked by size on sturdy wooden shelves, and packets of seeds, some clearly saved from the garden itself, filled an old card catalogue. With handwritten labels in fading ink, on the main workbench, covered by 3 years of dust, lay an open notebook filled with planting schedules, maintenance reminders, and sketches of seasonal arrangements. Beside it sat a pair of antique pruning shears, their blades still sharp despite the rust that had claimed their brass fittings. Caleb picked up the shears, feeling their weight and balance. These were quality tools, the kind that lasted generations, when properly cared for. Engraved on one blade in flowing script were the initials EV, Serena Vale, he assumed, Serena's mother. She never went anywhere without those, Serena said softly from behind him. Even to the grocery store, she'd have them in her purse, just in case she spotted something that needed deadheading. The image was so vivid, so achingly familiar, that Caleb felt his throat tighten. Sarah had been the same way, always ready to rescue a neglected plant or collect seeds from something beautiful she'd encountered in her travels. "Your mother knew what she was doing," he said, setting the shears down carefully. "This whole place, it's not just a garden, it's a love letter." Serena's composure finally cracked. She turned away, but not before he saw the tears she'd been holding back. "I used to help her," she whispered, "when I was little, before school became everything, before I got so busy with my own life that I only visited on holidays. She always said we'd work in the garden together when I retired, that she'd teach me everything she knew." The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the conversations that would never happen, all the knowledge that had died with its keeper. "I don't know anything about gardens," Serena continued, her voice steadier now but still fragile. "I kill houseplants. I barely remember to water the orchid in my office. What you see here, this was all her, and I've let it die." Caleb set down the notebook and turned to face her fully. "You haven't let anything die. You've preserved it. Do you know how many people would have hired a crew to clear all this out and start over with something easier to maintain? You kept it even when it hurt to look at it. That tells me something about who you are. It tells you I'm a coward who couldn't face making decisions. It tells me you understood that some things are worth waiting for, even when you don't know what you're waiting for." He gestured toward the dusty tools and forgotten notebooks. "Your mother built something here that was meant to last beyond her lifetime. Maybe she knew that someday, when you were ready, you'd find a way to bring it back." Serena looked around the shed with new eyes, seeing not just abandonment, but possibility. "And you think you could do that? Bring it back?" "I know I could," Caleb said simply. "Question is, are you ready to see it come alive again?" The weight of the decision hung in the air between them. This wasn't just about hiring a landscaper to clean up overgrown gardens. This was about resurrection, about honoring the dead while embracing the possibility of new life. It was about trust, hers in his ability to see past the chaos to the beauty underneath, and his in her willingness to open her heart to the vulnerability that came with caring for growing things. Outside, the mockingbird continued its territorial songs, and somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called its haunting refrain. The garden waited, patient as only gardens can be, for the answer that would determine its fate. The decision to restore the garden was made not with dramatic pronouncements, but with the quiet practicality that marked both Caleb's and Serena's approaches to life's challenges. They spent another hour in the garden shed, with Caleb explaining what a proper restoration would entail, the seasonal timing, the careful balance between preservation and renewal, the patience required to coax beauty back from chaos. When Saturday arrived, Caleb made a choice that surprised even him. Instead of leaving Mia with their neighbor Mrs. Chen as usual, he asked if she'd like to see a very special garden that needs our help. Mia's enthusiasm was immediate and infectious. She packed her small backpack with what she considered garden essentials: a magnifying glass from her science kit, her sketch pad, colored pencils, and Peanut the elephant for moral support. Watching her preparations, Caleb felt a familiar pang of loss mixed with hope. Sarah would have loved this, her daughter discovering the magic of gardens the same way she had as a child. The drive to Millbrook Heights gave him time to explain about Miss Vale and her parents' garden, how sometimes beautiful things needed extra care to stay beautiful, and how helping others was one of the most important things a person could do. "Is she sad like you were when Mommy first got sick?" Mia asked, with the directness that children wielded like a gentle weapon. The question caught him off guard, partly because he hadn't realized how visible his grief had been to his young daughter, and partly because the comparison was more accurate than he'd considered. "Yes, sweetheart, I think she is sad like that." "Then we should definitely help her," Mia declared with 8-year-old certainty. "Mommy always said gardens make everything better." When they arrived at the estate, Serena met them at the gate with obvious nervousness. She'd clearly made an effort for their visit. Her hair was loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back, and she wore a soft blue sweater that brought out her eyes. But it was her uncertainty around Mia that touched Caleb most deeply. "You must be Mia," Serena said, crouching down to the child's level with careful formality. "Your father tells me you know about gardens." Mia studied Serena with the intense focus she usually reserved for interesting insects or complicated math problems. "Daddy says your garden is sleeping and needs to wake up. Can I help wake it up?" Something in Serena's expression shifted, a softening that transformed her entire face. "I think it would like that very much." They began the tour in the herb garden, where Mia's excitement proved contagious. She pointed out plants she recognized from the small container garden she and Caleb maintained on their apartment's fire. Escape asked a dozen questions about plants she didn't recognize and immediately began sketching the layout in her notebook. "See, Miss Vale," Mia explained earnestly, holding up her drawing, "if we clean up all the weeds and make the paths nice again, it could be like Mommy's fairy tale book. Each little garden room could tell a different story." Caleb watched Serena's face as Mia chattered on, noting how the woman's careful composure gradually gave way to genuine engagement. When Mia asked if she could see where the flowers for cutting grew, Serena led them to what had once been a formal cutting garden with visible enthusiasm. "My mother used to bring armloads of flowers into the house every few days," Serena explained, pointing to the overgrown beds. The dining room table was never without fresh arrangements. She said cut flowers were proof that beauty was meant to be shared, not hoarded. Mia stopped sketching and looked up solemnly. "That sounds like something my mommy would say. She always picked flowers for our kitchen table, even just little ones from our yard." The moment of shared understanding between woman and child was so profound that Caleb felt like an intruder, witnessing something sacred. But then Mia bounced back to her usual energy, pulling out her magnifying glass to examine a butterfly that had landed on a nearby bush. "Painted lady," she announced with authority. "They like flowers that are purple or orange. We should plant lots of those when we fix the garden." "We?" Serena asked, glancing at Caleb with raised eyebrows. "Mia has definite opinions about garden." "I'm planning," he said, trying to keep his voice light despite the way his chest had tightened at his daughter's casual assumption that they'd be part of this restoration long-term. They spent the rest of the morning exploring, with Mia serving as an enthusiastic intermediary between the adults. She asked Serena about her favorite colors, her favorite flowers, whether she liked gardens that were neat and tidy or gardens that looked like they grew wild. Each question drew Serena further out of her shell until she was laughing at Mia's stories and offering her own memories of childhood adventures in these same gardens. When they reached the rose garden, Mia's reaction was immediate and heartfelt. "Oh, they're so sad," she whispered, approaching the tangled mass of overgrown bushes with the same reverence she'd shown at Sarah's funeral. "But Daddy can fix them, can't you, Daddy? You fixed the roses at Mrs. Patterson's school when everyone said they were dead." Caleb knelt beside his daughter, pulling out Elena's antique pruning shears from his tool bag. He'd spent the previous evening cleaning and sharpening them, wanting to honor their history by restoring them to working condition. "Remember what Mommy always said about roses?" he asked gently. "They're brave," Mia recited. "They wear armor because they have soft hearts, but they're brave enough to bloom anyway." Serena's sharp intake of breath made them both look up. She was staring at the pruning shears with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. "Those were my mother's," she said quietly. "I hope you don't mind," Caleb said, suddenly uncertain. "I found them in the shed and thought, no, it's perfect." Serena's voice was thick with emotion. She'd want them used. She'd want them to help bring the roses back. Mia, with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possessed, reached out and took Serena's hand. "Miss Vale, do you want to help us save the first rose? Daddy says the first cut is the most important one." For a moment, Caleb thought Serena might refuse, might retreat behind the careful walls she'd spent years constructing, but then she squeezed Mia's small hand and nodded. "Show me what to do." Caleb selected a rose bush that was manageable but clearly viable, a bush that would respond well to careful pruning and give them visible success to build on. He demonstrated the proper angle for cuts, how to identify dead wood from living growth, how to encourage the shape the rose wanted to take, rather than forcing it into unnatural forms. Then he placed the shears in Serena's hands, his fingers covering hers to guide the first cut. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her focus was absolute. When the diseased branch fell away, revealing the healthy wood beneath, Mia clapped with delight. "Look, it's already better." For the next hour, they worked together on that single bush, with Caleb providing gentle instruction, Mia offering enthusiastic commentary, and Serena growing more confident with each cut. When they stepped back to admire their work, the transformation was remarkable. What had been a confused tangle of growth was now a properly shaped rose bush with clean lines and visible potential. "One down," Serena said, looking around at the dozens of other bushes that awaited attention. "Only about 50 more to go." "We have time," Caleb said simply. "Gardens teach patience better than anything else." As they walked back toward the house, Mia skipping ahead to examine something that had caught her attention, Serena touched Caleb's arm. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for bringing her, for sharing this with me. I'd forgotten what it felt like to hope for something." Caleb looked at his daughter, now crouched beside the dry fountain making friends with a small lizard, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the sharp pain of loss that had dominated his emotional landscape for so long, but something warmer and more complex. "Mia has that effect on people," he said. "Sarah always said she was born with extra hope to share with anyone who needed it." The following weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Caleb with its naturalness. He arrived at the estate each morning after dropping Mia at school, spending the cooler hours working on the heavy clearing and structural repairs the garden required. Serena had given him complete access to the property, along with a generous budget for materials and equipment rental that allowed him to work without the financial stress that had plagued his recent jobs. But it was the afternoons that had become precious to him, the hours after school when Mia joined them at the estate. What had begun as practical necessity Mrs. Chen was traveling to visit her daughter, had evolved into something that felt almost like family routine. Serena had transformed in the weeks since their first pruning session. The careful distance she'd maintained initially had given way to genuine engagement, not just with the garden restoration, but with Mia's boundless curiosity about everything from soil composition to the life cycle of butterflies. She'd even begun keeping a notebook of her own, recording Mia's observations alongside Caleb's technical instructions. On this particular afternoon, Caleb was working in the formal parterre garden, carefully removing years of invasive growth from the geometric box hedges that formed the garden structure. The work was meditative, but physically demanding, requiring the kind of focused attention that kept his hands busy while his mind processed the changes in his life. From across the garden, he could hear Mia's voice as she helped Serena plant new bulbs in what would become a spring-cutting garden. Their conversation drifted to him in fragments carried by the autumn breeze. "Miss Serena, why do you live in such a big house all by yourself? I suppose I never thought about living anywhere else. This has always been my home, but don't you get lonely?" "Daddy and I get lonely sometimes, even though we have each other." A pause, longer than usual, filled with the soft sound of soil being turned. "Yes, Mia, I do get lonely. You could get a dog. Dogs are good for loneliness. Or maybe a cat if you don't like dogs that jump on you." Serena's laugh was genuine, the kind Caleb had been hearing more often as she relaxed into their daily interactions. "What about you and your father? Do you think you might like a dog?" "Daddy says we can't have pets in our apartment. The lease says no, and anyway, we might have to move again if the rent goes up." The casual mention of their housing insecurity hit Caleb harder than he'd expected. He'd been working steadily, earning more from this single project than he had in months of odd jobs, but the fundamental uncertainty of their situation remained unchanged. When this garden restoration was complete, where would that leave them? "Move." Serena's voice carried a note of concern that made Caleb pause in his work. "Daddy tries not to worry me, but I hear him on the phone sometimes with the landlord. He thinks I'm asleep, but I'm not always asleep when he thinks I am." Caleb set down his pruning shears and moved closer, not wanting to eavesdrop, but unable to ignore a conversation that concerned his daughter's emotional well-being. "Is that why you come help with the garden?" Serena asked gently. "Because your father is working here?" "At first," Mia said with characteristic honesty, "but now I come because I like being here with you. You listen to me like grown-ups are supposed to listen, not like I'm just a kid who doesn't understand things. And you don't try to make me feel better about missing my mummy. You just let me miss her." The observation was so perceptive, so mature. For an 8-year-old, that Caleb felt his chest tighten with pride and protectiveness. Mia had learned too young to read the emotional currents around her, to manage other people's discomfort with her grief. "I miss my parents too," Serena said quietly. "It helps to have someone who understands that missing them doesn't mean we can't also be happy about new things, like the garden getting beautiful again, like the garden, and like having friends to share it with." Caleb resumed his work, but his attention was divided between the hedge restoration and the growing warmth between his daughter and Serena. He'd been so focused on the practical aspects of their arrangement, the work, the payment, the immediate benefits to both sides, that he'd failed to fully acknowledge the emotional investment all three of them were developing in this relationship. Later, as the afternoon light began to fade, and it was time to gather tools and head home, Serena approached him with obvious nervousness. "Caleb, could I ask you something about Mia's school situation?" He looked up from securing the wheelbarrow, immediately alert to the careful tone in her voice. "What about it? She mentioned that you've been looking at different schools for next year. Something about Lincoln Elementary being overcrowded?" It was true, though he hadn't realized Mia was aware of his concerns. Lincoln was a good school, but budget cuts had meant larger class sizes and fewer resources. He'd been researching alternatives, though most of the better options were either private schools he couldn't afford or public schools in districts where he couldn't afford to live. The educational landscape has gotten complicated, he said carefully. Unsure where this conversation was heading, there's a private school about 10 minutes from here, Millbrook Academy. It's small, excellent academic reputation, and they have an outstanding science program that includes environmental studies and botany. Serena spoke quickly, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation. They also have need-based scholarships, and I happen to know someone on their board of directors. Caleb felt a familiar wariness, the defensive reaction of a man who'd learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. Serena, I appreciate the thought, but please, just hear me out. She held up a hand, her expression earnest. This isn't charity. This is me recognizing exceptional potential in a child who's already taught me more about curiosity and resilience than I learned in 4 years of business school. Mia belongs in an environment that challenges her intellectually and nurtures her natural gifts. From where she sat examining a ladybug that had landed on her finger, Mia called out, "Are you talking about me? I can hear my name." Miss Serena was telling me about a school that has gardens where students can study plants, Caleb said, walking over to join his daughter. Mia's eyes lit up immediately. A school with gardens? Like real gardens where you learn about science by doing science? Exactly like that, Serena said, crouching down to Mia's level. They have greenhouse laboratories and outdoor classroom spaces, and students can design their own research projects. Could I study why some flowers close at night and others stay open? Mrs. Patterson said that was too advanced for 3rd grade, but I really want to know. Caleb felt something shift inside him, a recognition that his daughter's intellectual gifts might indeed outgrow what he could provide for her through traditional means. But accepting help, especially from someone whose life was so dramatically different from their own, felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. It's something to think about, he said diplomatically. But as they packed up and prepared to leave, as Mia chatted excitedly about schools with gardens and research projects, Caleb found himself wondering if his pride was serving his daughter's best interests. Sarah had always said that accepting help gracefully was as important as offering it, that community was built on the willingness to both give and receive. That evening, after Mia had fallen asleep clutching one of her garden sketches, Caleb sat at their small kitchen table with a packet of information Serena had quietly pressed into his hands. Millbrook Academy's brochure showed children engaged in exactly the kind of hands-on learning that would challenge and inspire Mia, but it also represented a world far removed from their current reality, a world where his daughter might thrive, but might also grow beyond him. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, the way all truly transformative opportunities tend to be. November brought the first hard frost to the estate, and with it a sense of urgency that had been building slowly through the amber days of October. The garden restoration had reached a critical phase. Most of the heavy clearing work was complete. The structural elements were restored, and now came the delicate process of preparing established plants for winter while planning for spring's rebirth. Caleb had hung an old rope swing from one of the massive oak trees near the pond, a project that had begun as a simple repair job, but had evolved into something more meaningful. The original swing had been there in Serena's childhood, she'd told them, a place where she'd spent countless summer afternoons reading while her mother worked in the nearby flower beds. Finding it buried under years of overgrowth had felt like discovering a piece of lost innocence. Mia had claimed the swing immediately, declaring it the perfect spot for garden supervision while the adults worked. From her perch, she could see most of the restored areas, and she'd appointed herself chief observer of the garden's daily changes. Her sketchpad had filled with detailed drawings of everything from the frost patterns on the herb garden to the way morning light filtered through the bare branches of the dogwoods. "Daddy, look!" she called out this particular morning, pumping her legs to gain height on the swing. "The roses you and Miss Serena pruned are growing little red bumps." Caleb paused in his work, mulching the perennial beds, and smiled. "Those are leaf buds, sweetheart. The plants are getting ready for spring, even though winter hasn't really started yet." "How do they know?" Mia asked, the kind of question that had become routine in their afternoons at the estate. "How do plants know what season is coming?" Before Caleb could answer, Serena emerged from the house, carrying a thermos of hot chocolate and wearing a thick cardigan that made her look younger, more approachable than the crisp professional attire she'd favored when they first met. "They can sense the days getting shorter," she said, settling onto the old stone bench beneath the oak tree. "Plants are much smarter than most people give them credit for. They read signals we can't even detect. Changes in light, temperature, humidity. They're always preparing for what's coming next." Over the past weeks, Serena had surprised them both with her growing botanical knowledge. She'd been reading voraciously, not just her mother's garden journals, but modern books on sustainable gardening, plant biology, and landscape restoration. The woman who'd once claimed to kill houseplants was now confidently discussing the dormancy requirements of various rose cultivars. "Miss Serena," Mia said, accepting the offered mug of hot chocolate, "do you think people are like plants? Can we tell when changes are coming?" It was the kind of profound question that Mia specialized in, the sort that stopped adult conversation entirely while everyone processed its implications. "I think maybe we can," Serena said carefully, "but I think we're not always as good at preparing for change as plants are." Caleb found himself watching Serena as she talked with his daughter, noting the way her entire demeanor had shifted over their weeks of shared work. The careful reserve had given way to genuine warmth, and the brittle composure had been replaced by something more flexible, more alive. She laughed easily now, got dirt under her fingernails without self-consciousness, and had developed the kind of casual banter with Mia that spoke to real affection rather than polite interest. The transformation was beautiful to witness, but it also complicated feelings Caleb had been trying to keep strictly professional. Watching Serena guide Mia through the proper technique for planting spring bulbs, seeing her face light up when his daughter shared some bit of 8-year-old wisdom, observing the way she'd begun to anticipate Mia's needs and interests, it all painted a picture of domestic intimacy that was as appealing as it was dangerous. "I have news," Serena said, pulling a letter from her cardigan pocket. "From Millbrook Academy." Caleb's attention snapped into sharp focus. He'd submitted Mia's application the previous week, along with the portfolio of her garden observations and sketches that Serena had suggested. The process had been more thorough than anything he'd experienced with public school enrollment, including an interview where Mia had charmed the admissions director by explaining her theory about why some flowers were more attractive to bees than others. "Already?" he asked, setting down his mulch fork. "The head of admissions is a friend," Serena said, offering the envelope to Mia. She was quite taken with a certain young scientist's application. Mia tore open the envelope with the eager impatience of childhood, her eyes scanning the formal letterhead with fierce concentration. Suddenly her face broke into a grin that could have powered the entire estate. "I got in!" she shrieked, jumping down from the swing to throw herself at Caleb. "Daddy, I got into the school with the gardens!" The joy was infectious, and Caleb found himself laughing as he spun his daughter around, her excitement temporarily overwhelming his own complicated feelings about the opportunity. When he set her down, she immediately ran to Serena, who caught her in a hug that spoke to months of growing attachment. "There's more," Serena said, her voice carefully neutral. "They're offering a full scholarship, including the extended day program and summer enrichment opportunities." The financial relief was enormous. Millbrook Academy's tuition was more than Caleb earned in a year, but it was the implications that made his chest tight with emotion. This wasn't just about education, it was about opportunity, about access to a world that could shape Mia's entire future. "Miss Serena, can I call Mrs. Patterson and tell her?" Mia asked, bouncing with excitement. "She's going to be so proud." "Of course," Serena said, pulling out her phone. "But first, maybe we should..." Talk about the practical details with your father. As Mia chatted excitedly into the phone with her current teacher, Caleb and Serena walked toward the restored herb garden, needing privacy for the conversation that would determine how they moved forward. "This is incredibly generous," Caleb began, but Serena cut him off with a gesture. "It's not generosity, it's investment in exceptional potential." Her voice carried the businesslike tone she used when she wanted to forestall argument. "Mia belongs in an environment that challenges her. You've seen how she responds to complex concepts, how she makes connections that surprise even her current teacher." "And what happens when this project is finished?" Caleb asked quietly. "When the garden is restored and you don't need my services anymore, where does that leave her school situation?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications. Neither of them had been willing to address directly. The garden restoration was nearing completion, another few weeks of finish work and seasonal preparations, and his job here would be done. "I've been thinking about that," Serena said, not quite meeting his eyes. "The garden isn't something you restore once and forget about. It needs ongoing care, seasonal maintenance, someone who understands what your mother and I have built here. You're offering me a permanent position?" The possibility hadn't occurred to him, perhaps because it felt too much like something he might want, rather than something he could realistically expect. "I'm offering you the position of head gardener," Serena said firmly, "with a proper salary, benefits and housing if you're interested. There's a caretaker's cottage on the far side of the property that's been empty for years. It would need some work, but it has good bones and plenty of space for a family." The offer was everything he could have hoped for: financial security, meaningful work, a stable home for Mia. But it was also something more complex, an arrangement that would bind their lives together in ways that went far beyond the professional relationship they'd maintained. "Serena," he said carefully, "what are we doing here?" She finally met his eyes, and in them he saw the same uncertainty and hope that he'd been carrying for weeks. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know I don't want it to end." The acknowledgement of feelings between Caleb and Serena created a subtle shift in the dynamic at the estate, like a change in barometric pressure that everyone could sense, but no one directly addressed. They continued their work with the same dedication, but now there were moments, hands brushing as they passed tools, lingering conversations after Mia had fallen asleep on the garden bench, shared glances over her head when she said something particularly insightful that carried the weight of possibility. December brought the first snow, and with it the discovery of what would become Mia's most treasured artifact from their time at the estate. While exploring the area around the cottage that might become their new home, she found a small music box buried under leaves and debris near what had once been a child's garden plot. The music box was tarnished and silent, its delicate ballerina frozen mid-pirouette. But when Caleb cleaned the mechanism and wound the key, it played a hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed to capture something essential about the estate itself: elegant, melancholy, and full of stories waiting to be told. "It was mine," Serena said, when Mia brought the treasure to show her. "I'd forgotten all about it. My grandmother gave it to me for my 6th birthday, and I used to keep it in my playhouse in the garden." "Did you have a playhouse?" Mia asked. "With the kind of reverence children reserved for truly magical concepts. Nothing fancy," Serena said, but her eyes had taken on the distant look that came when she was remembering her childhood. "Just a little shed that my father fixed up with windows and shelves and a child-sized table. I spent hours there in the summer, reading and playing with dolls and pretending to be a grown-up with my own house." "Could we fix it up again?" Mia asked hopefully. "If we moved to the cottage, could I have a playhouse too?" The casual way Mia had begun to speak about their potential move to the estate made Caleb's chest tighten with both hope and apprehension. His daughter had embraced the possibility with the wholehearted enthusiasm she brought to everything. But for him, the decision carried implications that kept him awake at night. Taking the job would mean financial security and meaningful work. Yes, but it would also mean building a life intimately connected to Serena's in ways that went far beyond employment. The cottage sat less than a quarter mile from the main house, close enough that their daily lives would inevitably intertwine. Close enough that whatever was developing between him and Serena would either flourish or create complications that could affect all of them. We should probably see what condition the playhouse is in before we make any promises, Caleb said diplomatically, but he was already mentally cataloguing what it would take to restore the small structure he'd noticed. Half hidden behind overgrown shrubs, that afternoon, while Mia napped on the living room sofa, a privilege she'd claimed during their increasingly frequent indoor time, as the weather grew colder, Caleb and Serena worked together preparing the greenhouse for winter. The structure itself was magnificent. A Victorian-style conservatory that had been updated with modern climate controls but retained its original character. "I've been thinking about what you said," Serena said, carefully repotting a collection of herbs they'd brought in from the outdoor garden. "About what we're doing here." Caleb paused in his work organizing seed packets for spring planting, waiting for her to continue. "I think we're building something," she said, not looking at him directly. "I'm just not sure what to call it." The honesty in her voice made him set down the packets entirely and give her his full attention. Over the months they'd worked together, he'd learned to recognize when Serena was struggling with something important, the way her careful composure would develop tiny cracks that let glimpses of vulnerability show through. "What would you like to call it?" he asked gently. "I don't know." She set down her own work and finally met his eyes. "I know that for the first time in 3 years, I wake up looking forward to the day. I know that when Mia talks about her future, I find myself wanting to be part of it. And I know that when I imagine this place in 5 years, 10 years, I can't picture it without both of you." The admission hung between them, weighted with all the complexity of their situation. Two people from dramatically different worlds, each carrying their own grief and responsibilities, tentatively reaching towards something that felt both impossible and inevitable. "Serena," Caleb said carefully, "we need to be realistic about what this would mean. I'm a widowed father with an 8-year-old daughter and a pickup truck. You're a tech mogul with a Fortune 500 company and a house that could hold my entire apartment building. Those aren't small differences." "No, they're not," she agreed, "but they're not insurmountable either. People navigate differences all the time when there's something worth navigating toward." Before Caleb could respond, Mia's voice drifted from the doorway where she stood, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Are you talking about feelings?" she asked with characteristic directness. "Because you both get the same look on your faces that Daddy used to get when he was writing letters to Mommy after she died." The observation was so unexpectedly perceptive that both adults stared at her in surprise. "You wrote letters to Mommy?" Mia asked, approaching them with the fearless curiosity she brought to all subjects. "I did," Caleb admitted, "when I missed her too much to keep the feelings inside. Did it help? Sometimes. It helped me remember that loving someone doesn't, and just because they can't be with you anymore." Mia considered this with the seriousness she gave to all important concepts. "Miss Serena, do you think my mommy would like you?" The question clearly caught Serena off guard, but she answered thoughtfully. "I hope so. From everything your father has told me about her, she sounds like someone who cared most about your happiness and your father's happiness." "She did," Mia said with certainty. "And you make us happy. Different happy than Mommy did, but still happy. So I think she'd be okay." "With it!" The simplicity of childhood logic cut through all the complexity they'd been wrestling with, reducing their situation to its essential truth. They cared for each other, they were building something meaningful together, and happiness was worth pursuing, even when it came in unexpected forms. "Out of the mouths of babes," Serena said softly. That evening, as they shared dinner in the main house, a habit that had developed naturally as the weather grew colder. Caleb found himself studying the life they'd unconsciously created. Mia helping Serena set the table while chattering about her day. Classical music playing softly from speakers hidden throughout the house. The warm light of candles reflecting off windows that looked out onto gardens they'd restored together. It felt like home in a way that their small apartment never had, despite all his efforts to make it comfortable for Mia. But it also felt fragile, like something that could disappear if examined too closely, or if any of them made the wrong choice about their future. After dinner, while Mia worked on homework at the kitchen table, Caleb and Serena cleaned dishes side by side in a comfortable silence that spoke to their growing ease with each other's presence. "I have something to tell you," Serena said as she handed him a plate to dry. "My business partners have been asking questions about my extended absence from the office. They're concerned about my retreat from corporate responsibilities." The careful way she phrased it suggested there was more to the story, and Caleb felt the first stirring of unease about external pressures they hadn't yet had to face. What kind of questions? The kind that come when major stakeholders start wondering if their CEO has lost focus on the company's strategic direction. Her voice carried a tension he hadn't heard in weeks. "Tomorrow, I have to go into the city for a board meeting. It's time to address their concerns directly." The announcement felt like cold water on the warm domestic scene they'd been enjoying, a reminder that their garden sanctuary existed within a larger world that might not be as understanding of what they'd built together. The board meeting that Serena had anticipated as merely inconvenient turned out to be the beginning of the end of their carefully constructed sanctuary. She returned to the estate that evening with the kind of controlled composure that Caleb had learned to recognize as barely contained fury, her usual warmth replaced by something brittle and dangerous. Mia sensed the change immediately, the way children do when the emotional weather shifts around them. Instead of her usual exuberant greeting, she approached Serena cautiously, reading the signals that something significant had changed. "Miss Serena, are you okay?" she asked quietly, settling beside her on the garden bench where they'd shared so many afternoon conversations. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Serena said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Just some complicated grown-up business that needs sorting out." Caleb finished securing the tools they'd been using to prepare the perennial beds for winter and joined them, noting the tension in Serena's shoulders and the way she avoided direct eye contact. "How bad?" he asked simply. Serena was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky over gardens that had become so much more than a restoration project. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of decisions that would affect all their lives. "They want me back full-time, immediately. There's talk of a board vote to remove me as CEO if I don't demonstrate renewed commitment to the company's strategic objectives." She paused, then added with bitter precision, "Apparently, my extended sabbatical has raised questions about my fitness to lead a company of Vale Technologies' stature." The corporate language felt foreign in the context of their garden sanctuary, like a harsh spotlight suddenly illuminating something that had flourished in softer light. "What kind of commitment are they looking for?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 60-hour weeks minimum. Extensive travel for client meetings and investor relations, full engagement with the company's expansion into Southeast Asian markets. Each requirement fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would reach every corner of their shared life. "They've made it clear that my recent priorities are incompatible with corporate leadership." Mia, who had been listening with the intense focus she brought to adult conversations that might affect her world, spoke up with characteristic directness. "They want you to stop spending time with us." It wasn't a question, and the simple clarity of it hit harder than any corporate ultimatum. "It's not that simple, Mia," Serena began, but the child interrupted with unusual firmness. "Yes, it is. They want you to choose between your company and your family. That's exactly that simple. The word family hung in the air between them, spoken with such matter-of-fact certainty that it took Caleb's breath away. Somewhere in the past months, without any formal acknowledgement or official transition, that's exactly what they'd become. Before anyone could respond, the sound of car engines approaching up the driveway broke the evening stillness. Multiple vehicles moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of expected visitors. "Are you expecting anyone?" Caleb asked, immediately alert to potential trouble. Serena's expression shifted to something closer to dread. "No, but I have a suspicion about who this might be." The first vehicle was a black sedan with tinted windows, followed by a van with equipment that even from a distance looked like professional photography gear. As they parked in the circular drive, people emerged with the efficient purposefulness of a well-coordinated operation. "Tabloid photographers," Serena said grimly. "Someone tipped them off about my mysterious retreat from public life." The realization hit Caleb like cold water. In all their months of building a life together at the estate, he'd somehow managed to forget that Serena's world came with a level of public scrutiny that his never had. Their private sanctuary was about to become very public indeed. "Daddy, what's happening?" Mia asked, pressing closer to him as strangers with cameras began setting up equipment near the fountain. "We need to get you inside," Caleb said, scooping her up despite her protests that she was too old to be carried. "Now!" They made it to the house just as the first camera flashes began, but not before several photographs had been taken of the three of them together in what would undoubtedly be portrayed as a domestic scene. Through the windows, they could see reporters and photographers spreading out across the property, documenting everything from the restored gardens to Caleb's truck parked beside Serena's luxury sedan. "How did they find out?" Caleb asked, as Serena closed the curtains with sharp, angry movements. "My business partners, most likely. Or someone on my staff who noticed the checks I've been writing for garden supplies and contractor fees." She turned from the windows with an expression he'd never seen before, cold, calculating, every trace of the warm woman who'd spent the afternoon teaching Mia about winter plant identification buried beneath corporate armor. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental. The implications were becoming clear, and they were worse than Caleb had initially understood. This wasn't just unwanted media attention. It was a coordinated attack designed to force Serena to choose between her public responsibilities and her private happiness. As if summoned by his thoughts, Serena's phone began ringing with the insistent tone she'd assigned to her business manager. She answered with clipped professionalism. "Yes, Marcus, I'm aware of the situation. No, I won't be making any statements tonight, because I need time to consider my options before I respond to what is obviously a calculated leak." She ended the call and immediately turned off the phone, but the damage was already done. The outside world had found their sanctuary, and it had come armed with cameras and consequences. "There's more," Serena said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of activity outside. "Something I should have told you weeks ago." Caleb felt his stomach drop, recognizing the tone that preceded revelations that changed everything. "Marcus received a call this afternoon from a law firm representing your former in-laws. They've been monitoring the situation apparently, and they're filing for emergency custody of Mia." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending ice through his veins. "What?" "They're claiming that your involvement with me represents an unstable environment for Mia, that you're pursuing financial gain through a relationship with someone of questionable moral character." Serena's voice remained carefully controlled, but he could see the fury burning beneath her corporate composure. "They have photographs, documentation of our relationship, and they're arguing that you're putting Mia at risk by exposing her to media attention and an unconventional living situation." Mia, who had been quietly coloring at the kitchen table while the adults talked, looked up with the sharp attention that meant she'd been listening to more than they'd realized. "Are the mean people going to take me away from Daddy?" she asked with the kind of direct terror that only children could voice so simply. The question hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with all the fears they'd been too hopeful to acknowledge. Everything they'd built together, the restored garden, the growing love, the sense of family that had seemed so natural and right, was under attack from forces that saw it as threat rather than blessing. "No one is taking you anywhere," Caleb said with fierce certainty, pulling his daughter close. "I won't let that happen." But even as he spoke the words, he could feel the ground shifting beneath them. The sanctuary they'd created was no longer safe, and the choices ahead would require them to fight for everything that mattered, or risk losing it all to people who measured worth in headlines and legal precedents rather than love and genuine happiness. Outside, the camera flashes continued, documenting the end of their privacy and the beginning of a battle that none of them had wanted, but all of them would have to fight. The manila folder that contained the private investigator's report arrived by courier. An hour later, its contents a clinical dissection of every moment they'd shared, every gesture of affection, every sign that they'd built something beautiful together. In the hands of lawyers and tabloid editors, their love story had become evidence of poor judgment and moral failing. The plot twist wasn't just that their private world had been exposed, it was that exposure itself had been weaponized, turned into a threat that could cost Caleb the thing he valued most in the world. Their choice to love each other had made them vulnerable in ways they'd never anticipated, and now they would have to decide whether that love was worth fighting for, against. Overwhelming odds. The days following the media invasion passed in a blur of legal consultations, strategy sessions, and the kind of careful maneuvering that neither Caleb nor Serena had ever imagined would be necessary to protect their family. The estate, once a sanctuary of peace and restoration, had become a fortress under siege, its gates monitored by security guards and its privacy invaded by long-lens cameras positioned at every possible vantage point. Mia handled the upheaval with the resilience that had carried her through her mother's death, but Caleb could see the strain in the way she clung more tightly to both him and Serena, in the careful way she avoided the windows that faced the road, in the questions she asked about whether loving someone was supposed to be so complicated. "The custody hearing is scheduled for next Friday," Caleb's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Hernandez, announced during their morning strategy session in Serena's study. "Judge Morrison is fair but conservative, and your former in-laws' legal team has done their homework. They're painting a picture of moral irresponsibility and financial opportunism that we need to counter with facts and character witnesses." The irony wasn't lost on Caleb that the same qualities that had made him attractive as a son-in-law, his steady reliability, his devotion to family, his willingness to work hard for those he loved, were being reframed as weaknesses and character flaws. In the hands of skilled attorneys, his grief had become instability, his financial struggles, evidence of poor judgment, and his relationship with Serena proof of mercenary motives. "What about Mia's preferences?" Serena asked from her position near the window, where she'd been watching her security team coordinate with local police to manage the media presence. "Surely the court considers what she wants." "They do, but she's 8 years old. The judge will weigh her stated preferences against what he perceives as her best interests." Patricia's tone was professional, but not unsympathetic. "The challenge is that children often prefer what's familiar and immediate over what might be better for them long-term. Your former in-laws are arguing that Mia's attachment to this situation is precisely what makes it dangerous for her." The logic was circular and maddening. Mia loved their life together, therefore that life was bad for her because it had created an attachment that could be disrupted. The fact that the disruption was being caused by the very people claiming to protect her seemed irrelevant to the legal proceedings. "There is one thing that could make a significant difference," Patricia continued, consulting her notes with the careful precision of someone who understood that details mattered in ways that could change lives. Judge Morrison has a reputation for being influenced by demonstrations of stable, long-term commitment. If there were evidence that this relationship represents genuine partnership rather than temporary convenience, she let the implication hang in the air, and Caleb felt his chest tighten with understanding. Marriage? She was talking about marriage as a legal strategy, a way to demonstrate commitment that courts would recognize and respect. That's not why we're together, he said quietly. But even as he spoke the words, he was aware of how naive they sounded in the context of custody battles and media scrutiny. Of course not, Patricia agreed. But the court doesn't know that. They're looking at external evidence of stability and commitment, and legal marriage carries weight that other arrangements don't. Serena turned from the window, her expression unreadable. How much weight? Considerable. A stable married couple with financial resources and a demonstrated commitment to the child's welfare. That's a much harder target for your opponents to attack than an unmarried relationship between people from different social backgrounds. The clinical way Patricia described their love made Caleb's stomach turn, but he understood the practicality behind her reasoning. In the eyes of the law, what mattered wasn't the depth of their feelings or the genuine care they'd built together. It was the external markers that society recognized as legitimate. How much time do we have to make such a decision? Serena asked, her voice carefully neutral. The hearing is in 6 days. If you were to marry before then, it would need to be soon enough to avoid appearing calculated for the court's benefit. After Patricia left, Caleb and Serena sat in the study in silence, the weight of impossible choices settling around them like dust. Outside, they could hear Mia playing in the garden under the watchful eye of one of the security guards, her laughter, a bright note in the gathering storm of adult complications. "This isn't how I imagined proposing," Caleb said finally, attempting humor but hearing the strain in his own voice. "This isn't how I imagined being proposed to," Serena replied, but there was something in her tone that made him look at her more. Carefully. Are we actually considering this? Serena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the garden where they'd first begun to fall in love. "I keep thinking about what Mia said, that your wife would want you to be happy. Do you think she'd want you to marry someone to keep Mia safe?" It was a question he'd been avoiding, partly because the answer felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory, and partly because it forced him to examine motivations that were more complex than he wanted to acknowledge. "Sarah would have done anything to protect Mia," he said slowly. "She would have married a stranger if it meant keeping our daughter safe and loved. But that's not what this is," Serena said, finally meeting his eyes. "Is it?" The question hung between them, loaded with months of shared mornings in the garden, quiet evenings reading to Mia, the gradual building of something that felt like forever, even when they'd been careful not to name it. "No," Caleb said quietly. "It's not." What followed was perhaps the most unconventional proposal in the history of romantic relationships, a practical discussion of legal timing, a mutual acknowledgement of love that had grown from shared purpose, and the recognition that sometimes the right choice was also the expedient choice. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony in the estate's garden, with Mia as their witness and a justice of the peace who specialized in discreet unions for high-profile clients. Serena wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, Caleb his only good suit, and Mia a white dress with flower petals in her hair that she'd insisted on collecting herself from the roses they'd restored together. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity, but it was also conducted under the shadow of telephoto lenses and the knowledge that their wedding photos would be analyzed in courtrooms and gossip columns with equal intensity. The key to the garden gate that Serena had given him as a wedding ring, an ornate brass key that had belonged to her grandmother, felt both symbolic and practical, a token of access to the life they were fighting to preserve. "Do you think Mommy "Would like Miss Serena?" Mia asked that evening as Caleb tucked her into bed in what was now officially their home. "I think," Caleb said carefully, "that Mommy would like anyone who loves you as much as Serena does." "Good," Mia said with satisfaction, "because I asked her, and she said yes." It took Caleb a moment to understand what his daughter meant, and when he did, his throat tightened with emotion. "You asked her what, sweetheart?" "If she wanted to be my new mommy, not instead of my real mommy, but like my extra mommy. She said she'd be honored." The conversation they'd apparently had without him spoke to the kind of deep understanding that had been building between Serena and Mia from their first meeting, but it also highlighted the stakes of the coming custody battle. They weren't just fighting for the right to continue their relationship. They were fighting for the right to be the family they'd already become. The final preparation for the custody hearing involved character witnesses, financial documentation, and the kind of background investigation that turned private lives into public evidence. Teachers testified to Mia's happiness and academic progress. Neighbors spoke to Caleb's character and parenting abilities. Even Mrs. Chen, their former neighbor, traveled from her daughter's house to testify about the positive changes she'd witnessed in both father and daughter since they'd begun working at the estate. But it was Serena's decision about her corporate responsibilities that represented the most significant gamble of all. The night before the hearing, she submitted her resignation as CEO of Vale Technologies, choosing to step down rather than abandon the family they'd built together. "Are you sure about this?" Caleb asked, as she finished the letter that would end her executive career. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said simply. "I spent 3 years building walls to protect myself from feeling anything. You and Mia didn't just tear down those walls. You showed me what I'd been protecting myself from. A company can replace a CEO. Mia can't replace her father, and I can't replace this chance at happiness." The sacrifice was enormous. Vale Technologies represented decades of her professional life, financial security beyond imagination, and the kind of power and influence that few people ever achieved. But as Caleb watched her seal the resignation letter, he understood that she wasn't losing something. She was choosing something. The morning of the custody hearing dawned clear and cold, with the kind of bright winter light that made the restored garden look like something from a fairy tale. As they prepared to leave for the courthouse, Mia picked a single rose from the bush they'd pruned together on her first day at the estate. A bloom that had defied the season to flower one last time before winter truly settled in. "For luck," she explained, tucking the rose into Serena's jacket pocket. "Daddy says roses are brave, and we need to be brave today too." The courthouse steps were lined with reporters and photographers, their cameras creating a gauntlet that Caleb, Serena, and Mia had to navigate to reach the relative sanctuary of the building's interior. The scene felt surreal, their private. Family crisis transformed into public spectacle, their love story reduced to headlines about tech moguls and custody battles. Mia walked between them, holding both their hands with the kind of fierce determination that had carried her through every challenge in her young life. She wore her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers that Serena had helped her choose, and carried herself with a dignity that made Caleb's chest swell with pride even as his stomach churned with anxiety. "Remember," Patricia whispered as they made their way through the courthouse corridors, "this is about demonstrating stability, commitment, and what's genuinely best for Mia. Don't let them provoke you into emotional responses that can be used against you." The courtroom itself was smaller than Caleb had expected, its wood-paneled walls and formal atmosphere creating an environment where personal relationships would be dissected with clinical precision. Judge Morrison, a silver-haired man in his 60s, presided with the kind of measured authority that suggested decades of making decisions that changed lives forever. Caleb's former in-laws, Robert and Margaret Whitfield, sat with their attorney. At the plaintiff's table, their faces carefully composed masks of concern and moral righteousness. They dressed for the part, conservative clothing, modest jewelry, everything designed to project stability and traditional values. Margaret had been crying, though whether from genuine emotion or strategic calculation, Caleb couldn't determine. "Your Honor," the Whitfield's attorney began, "we're here today because we're deeply concerned about the welfare of 8-year-old Mia Brooks, who has been placed in an environment that prioritizes adult desires over child safety." The opening statement painted a picture of Caleb as a grieving widower who had made increasingly poor decisions in pursuit of financial security and romantic fulfillment. His relationship with Serena was characterized as opportunistic and unstable, their recent marriage dismissed as a transparent attempt to manipulate these proceedings. Mr. Brooks has exposed this innocent child to media scrutiny, unconventional living arrangements, and the emotional instability that comes from adult relationships built on financial dependency rather than genuine compatibility, the attorney continued. "My clients offer Mia the stability of a traditional family environment, excellent educational opportunities, and freedom from the circus atmosphere that currently surrounds her daily life." Each word felt like a knife thrust, partially because they contained enough truth to be plausible, and partially because they reframed every positive aspect of their life together as evidence of poor judgment. The garden restoration that had brought them together became proof of financial desperation. The love that had grown between Serena and Mia was reduced to manipulation and confusion. When Patricia rose to present their defense, Caleb felt the weight of everything they'd built together resting on her ability to translate their lived experience into legal arguments that would resonate with a judge who knew them only through documentation and testimony. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of poor judgment or unstable relationships, but rather a coordinated attack on a family that threatens certain business interests," Patricia began, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that commanded attention. "Mr. Brooks is not an opportunist. He's a devoted father who has rebuilt his life with remarkable success while prioritizing his daughter's emotional and educational needs above all else." She presented evidence of Mia's academic achievements, her emotional stability, and her obvious happiness in their current situation. Character witnesses testified to Caleb's parenting abilities, Serena's genuine care for Mia, and the positive changes all three had experienced since their lives became intertwined. But it was when Serena herself took the stand that the courtroom atmosphere shifted into something more electric and unpredictable. "Ms. Vale," the Whitfield's attorney began, his tone suggesting he was about to spring a trap, "you've resigned from your position as CEO of Vale Technologies. Is that correct?" "Yes. A position that provided you with considerable income and social status?" "Yes. And you resigned this position shortly before marrying Mr. Brooks, correct?" "I resigned because I chose my family over my corporate responsibilities," Serena said, her voice steady despite the obvious direction of the questioning. "Your family? You've known Mr. Brooks for less than 6 months, and you consider him family?" "I consider Mia and Caleb my family, yes. They've brought more genuine happiness into my life than 30 years of corporate success ever did." "Ms. Vale, isn't it true that your relationship with Mr. Brooks began as a simple business transaction, hiring him to maintain your property?" "That's how it began, yes. And isn't it true that you've used your considerable financial resources to essentially purchase a ready-made family by offering Mr. Brooks employment, housing, and educational opportunities for his daughter?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Caleb felt his heart stop as he waited for Serena's response. This was the trap they'd been building toward. The suggestion that their entire relationship was transactional, that love could be reduced to financial arrangements and mutual benefit. But when Serena answered, her voice carried a quiet conviction that cut through all the legal maneuvering and strategic positioning. "Mr. Harrison, If you could purchase the kind of love I've found with Caleb and Mia, don't you think more people would be happy? What we have can't be bought or sold or manufactured. It grew from shared work, mutual respect, and the recognition that we were better together than we were apart. The simplicity of her answer seemed to catch the attorney off guard, and for a moment the courtroom was silent, except for the soft sound of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. No further questions, Harrison said, but his tone suggested the exchange hadn't gone as he'd planned. The moment that would determine Mia's future came when Judge Morrison asked to speak with her privately in his chambers. It was a conversation that would carry more weight than all the character witnesses and legal arguments combined. The voice of the child whose life hung in the balance. Caleb felt his heart stop as his daughter disappeared through the chamber doors with the court bailiff. Everything they'd built together, all the love and trust and daily joy that had become their life, would be filtered through an 8-year-old's ability to articulate feelings that even adults struggled to express. "She'll be fine," Serena whispered, taking his hand. "Mia knows her own mind better than most adults I know." 20 minutes felt like 20 hours before the chamber doors opened again, and Mia emerged, her face serious but not distressed. She walked directly to Caleb and climbed into his lap, a privilege the court had granted given her age and the emotional weight of the proceedings. "The court," Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying the gravity of decisions that would reshape lives, has heard compelling testimony from both sides regarding the best interests of Mia Brooks. He paused, consulting his notes while the courtroom held its collective breath. The plaintiff's concerns about media attention and unconventional living arrangements are not without merit. A child's need for stability and privacy must be weighed carefully against other considerations. Caleb felt his stomach drop, certain that this preamble was leading toward a decision that would tear their family apart. "However," the judge continued, "the court must also consider the evidence of genuine stability, academic achievement, and emotional well-being that has been clearly demonstrated in the current arrangement." Another pause, this one stretching until Caleb thought he might stop breathing entirely. Most significantly, the court has had the opportunity to speak directly with Mia herself, and her testimony has been both articulate and persuasive regarding her own understanding of her best interests. Judge Morrison looked directly at Mia as he spoke, his stern, judicial demeanor softening slightly. "This young lady has demonstrated remarkable maturity and insight in describing her current family situation. Her academic progress, emotional stability, and clear articulation of her feelings about the people in her life suggest a child who is thriving rather than suffering in her current environment." The judge's gavel seemed to hover in the air for an eternity before it finally came down. The petition for emergency custody change is denied. Mia Brooks will remain in the custody of her father, Caleb Brooks, and his wife, Serena Brooks. The sound that escaped from Margaret Whitfield was part sob, part gasp of outrage, but it was drowned out by the collective exhale of relief from their side of the courtroom. Caleb buried his face in Mia's hair, overwhelmed by gratitude and the magnitude of what they'd almost lost. But it was what happened next that would define not just the legal victory, but the public perception that had threatened to destroy them. As they prepared to leave the courtroom, facing another gauntlet of media attention, Serena made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Your Honor," she said, rising from her seat, "may I address the court one final time?" Judge Morrison nodded, clearly curious about what additional statement she might want to make. Serena stood at the defendant's table, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom and through the media presence to a much larger audience. "6 months ago, I was a woman who had convinced herself that success meant building walls high enough to keep pain out, even if it also kept love out. I hired Caleb Brooks to restore my parents' garden, thinking I was purchasing a service. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, the careful corporate composure giving way to something more genuine and powerful. What I discovered was that some things can't be bought or sold or negotiated. What grew between us, all three of us, was the kind of love that makes people better than they were before. Caleb didn't see a business opportunity when he looked at dying roses. He saw potential for beauty. He didn't see financial advantage when he met a lonely woman hiding in an empty house. He saw someone worth caring about. She turned slightly to include Caleb and Mia in her gaze, and Mia didn't see a stranger who could provide advantages. She saw someone who needed the kind of hope and joy that children give freely when they're loved properly. Our family wasn't built on transactions or convenience or mutual benefit. It was built on the daily choice to care for each other, to show up for each other, and to believe that tomorrow could be better than today if we faced it together. The courtroom was absolutely silent, the kind of profound quiet that comes when truth cuts through all the noise and complication of human conflict. I'm not asking for privacy or understanding from the media. I'm simply stating for the record, and for anyone who wants to listen, that love isn't something you can dissect in a courtroom or reduce to financial arrangements. It's something you tend like a garden, with patience, commitment, and faith that what you're nurturing will grow into something beautiful. She sat down to absolute silence, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Then Judge Morrison spoke, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present in his earlier judicial pronouncements. Mrs. Brooks, that may be the most eloquent statement about the nature of family that this court has ever heard. As they finally made their way through the courthouse and into the bright winter afternoon, the media attention felt different somehow, less invasive, more respectful. Serena's public declaration had reframed their story from scandal to something approaching inspiration. But the most important reaction came from Mia herself, who looked up at both of them with the kind of satisfied smile that suggested the adults had finally figured out something she'd known all along. "Can we go home now?" she asked simply. "I want to check on the roses." 6 months after the custody hearing, on a golden morning in late spring, Caleb stood in the same herb garden where he'd first truly understood the scope of what Serena's parents had created. The lavender was in full bloom, filling the air with its sweet fragrance, and the geometric beds that had once been choked with weeds now displayed the kind of careful abundance that comes from patient, knowledgeable care. The transformation was complete, but it was more than just a restoration. It was a renaissance. Under their combined attention, the garden had become something richer than its original design, incorporating new plantings that reflected both Mia's scientific curiosity and the family's shared vision of beauty that served multiple purposes. "Daddy, look," Mia called from the cutting garden, where she was carefully harvesting flowers for the arrangements that had become her specialty. At 9 years old, she had developed an artist's eye for color and form, creating compositions that would have impressed even Elena Vale. "The cosmos you planted are finally opening." The cosmos had been his addition to the garden. Hardy, cheerful, flowers that bloomed reliably and attracted the butterflies that Mia loved to study. Watching her work among them, her hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail that Serena favored for garden work, Caleb felt the kind of deep contentment that he thought might never return after Sarah's death. It was different from the happiness he'd known before, deeper in some ways, more complex, built on the understanding that love could be lost and found again in forms that honored the past while embracing an unexpected future. "The memorial plaque looks perfect there," Serena said, emerging from the cottage where she'd been setting up her new home office. Her resignation from Vale Technologies had led not to retirement but to a new venture, a consulting firm that specialized in sustainable business practices and work-life integration. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, that her corporate crisis had become the foundation for a more fulfilling career. The brass plaque Caleb was admiring read, "The Sarah and Eleanor Memorial Garden," in elegant script, mounted on a weathered stone. post at the entrance to what had become the heart of their shared space. It was Mia's idea, her way of ensuring that the women who had taught them about love and gardens would always be part of their story. "I think Mom would like that her roses are helping Elena's roses grow better," Mia had explained when she'd suggested the memorial. The child's understanding of how love could transcend death and connect generations had humbled both adults with its simple wisdom. The garden itself had become something of a local attraction, not because of its association with their highly publicized courtroom victory, but because word had spread about the quality of the restoration and the innovative educational programs they'd begun hosting. Millbrook Academy brought groups of students for hands-on botany lessons, and several other schools had requested similar arrangements. Mia, now thriving in her accelerated program, had become an unofficial tour guide, sharing her extensive knowledge about plant life cycles, beneficial insects, and sustainable gardening practices with visitors who were often amazed by her expertise and enthusiasm. "Mrs. Chen is bringing her garden club next week," Serena announced, consulting the tablet where she kept their surprisingly busy schedule. "And the county extension office wants to feature our butterfly habitat in their newsletter." The transformation extended beyond the garden itself. The cottage that had once housed estate caretakers had been renovated into a comfortable family home, with large windows that overlooked the gardens and enough space for Mia's expanding collection of scientific equipment and art supplies. Caleb's workshop, built in what had been a storage barn, had become the headquarters for Brooks Garden Design, his new business focused on restoration and sustainable landscaping. "I have news," Serena said, settling beside him on the bench beneath the oak tree where Mia's swing still hung, now joined by a more elaborate playset that accommodated her growing independence while maintaining the magical quality of childhood. "Play. Good news, I hope," Caleb said, noting the particular smile she wore when she was pleased about something. "The Children's Hospital downtown has approved our proposal for the Therapeutic Garden project. They want us to design and install a series of sensory gardens for their pediatric rehabilitation center." The project was something they'd been developing together, combining Caleb's horticultural expertise, Serena's business acumen, and Mia's insights about what children found most engaging in outdoor spaces. It represented the kind of meaningful work that none of them could have imagined individually. But that felt inevitable once they'd begun collaborating. "That's wonderful," Caleb said, meaning it completely. "Mia will be over the moon about designing spaces for other kids." "Speaking of Mia," Serena said, "she had a question for us at breakfast that I thought you should hear." From across the garden, they could hear their daughter chattering to herself as she worked, a habit that had developed as she'd grown more confident in her scientific observations and theories. "What kind of question?" "She wants to know if we're planning to give her a baby brother or sister," Serena said, her tone carefully neutral despite the smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The question caught Caleb off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Mia had always been direct about important matters, and in her mind, the completion of their family restoration might logically include expansion. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I told her that was a conversation she'd need to have with both of us," Serena said. "But I also told her that families grow in their own time and that love doesn't run out when it gets shared with more people." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Mia work among the flowers they'd all helped plant, listening to the sounds of a garden in full health, bees humming, birds calling, water moving in the restored fountain. "I love our life," Serena said quietly. "I love waking up here, working beside you, watching Mia discover new things every day. I love that we built something beautiful together, from something that was broken." "I love it too," Caleb replied, and realized as he said it that he could imagine this conversation continuing for decades, sitting in this garden, watching seasons change, celebrating the small daily miracles that made up a well-lived life, as, if summoned by their thoughts, Mia appeared before them with her arms full of flowers and her face bright with discovery. "I figured out why the butterfly garden works so well," she announced, settling between them on the bench with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who had never doubted her place in their family. "It's not just about the plants they like. It's about making a space where beautiful things feel safe to land." The observation was so perfect, so complete a description of what they'd built together, that both adults were quiet for a moment, absorbing the wisdom that had come from their youngest family member. "That's exactly right, sweetheart," Caleb said, pulling her close. "That's exactly what we've done." And in the garden that had brought them together, surrounded by the living proof of what patience and love could create, their family continued to grow and bloom, one season at a time.